Well, welcome to the library, the Episcopal Library of the Basilica of St. John the Baptist. So this is a National Historic Site. It dates from the 1850s, and it was the library built by Bishop John Thomas Mullock, and it houses, thinking, probably 5,000 or 6,000 of his books. And this collection was gathered by him and by some of the other bishops of Newfoundland in the early 19th century, and it became the first public library in Newfoundland. It was also a seminary library. St. Bonaventure's College next door was designed to be a seminary, but it never really became that. It became a school. So this was a school library and a public library, and there would be lectures and public talks and musical evenings and everything else. Cyrus Field, who was encouraged in the Atlantic Cable, was entertained by Bishop Mullock in this room. And this room is a National Historic Site. It's also got a set of exhibits here, two exhibits that are here in the Basilica Museum, because we have our museum here. So one is the sacred vessels, the treasures of the Basilica over the last 2.5 centuries. And the other one is the story of Thomas Nangle, who was the padre who built the Trail of the Caribou. He was a padre to the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, a chaplain. He was a Roman Catholic priest of this diocese, and he did Beaumont Hamel, the Trail of the Caribou, and the National War Memorial down on Duckworth Street. What you see here tells the story of the building of the Basilica, and it also is a narrative of donations of some of the treasures that have been made over the years. This room is also used. You entered through the Pastoral Center, which is really the old residence, the old Archbishop's Palace. So this is an operating room, an operating facility for the Archdiocese of St. John. So it's used as a multi-purpose room, a lecture room, and it serves its purpose for everything. So this would have been built in the 1850s, and the plaster ceiling is by the Conways, which is a very well-known St. John's company. And the bookcases were built by Bishop Mullock's father, Thomas, who was a carpenter. And unfortunately, the building you came through is the second one. The first one burned down in 1919. And when it burned down, because that building was a residence, they had to put residences and apartments in here in this room and they used it in fact until the 1970s, when they decided to restore the library again to its current configuration. To actually make the point, they've all been cataloged by Memorial University Library, and they can be searched online, and scholars who are interested in them and have used them can find them there, and they just make an appointment with the archivist here, who will put the white gloves, cotton gloves on them, and they're available for scholarships. So there are some incredible books here. The earliest one is from the 1530s, I think. We have a first edition Machiavelli the Prince, all kinds of philosophy and theology books, Irish history books. So there's some incredible things. That's Bishop Fleming's chalice and paten. It was a gift to him by the Franciscans at the Wexford Friary. And dates from 1768. Now, Fleming was born in the late 18th century and came to Newfoundland in 1823, so it's a small chalice. This is a set of chalice and in fact, ciborium, or communion cup, communion bowl, given to his successor, Bishop Mullock. And it's in a Georgian style, which would be typical of the 1780s to 1810-20 period. Even earlier, that's 1768. So
this is just decorative stones, the purple stones around the edges of the chalice there.
I think they're probably the amethysts. Not quite sure, but I do know that this one again was from John Smythe in Dublin in the 1860s, and that would be St. Patrick on the foot of each one of these. You can see with the round tower and probably St. Columba and a number of the other different Irish saints. After Bishop Fleming took over and started building the Basilica, they began to start receiving donations of things, but we have two more pieces of church plate that predate the Basilica, and they're right here. And it's these two here. If you go to Ottawa to the National Gallery of Canada, you will pay to go in to see an exhibit on the works of Laurent Amiot, who was a Quebec silversmith, and he flourished in the first 3 decades of the 19th century in Quebec. So we have a thurible by him, which is an incense holder that's on the chain there. And we have a ciborium, which again is a communion cup for folding the communion host and the communion wafers. So the National Gallery of Canada, I think, would like to have these, or like to have them on display.
Sure.
And our response to that is, that's lovely, but these ones are not leaving Newfoundland and Labrador. We know exactly what they are, and they're very carefully conserved here. We also have next to you the Cathedral Register, which was the book that began by hand, a ledger in 1837 by Bishop Mullock, and it records the names of all the fishermen, the sealers, and their ships, their vessels, that made donations to the construction of the basilica. So it was over about a 14-year period before Fleming died, and there are several thousand donations that were documented and made here. So that's where the money came from, and it also came from a number of donors and societies, organizations, groups, individuals. Yeah, so
1837. He kept by him until his death in 1850.
that's right. Is a photo of how this room was used, this library. It was described as the finest room in the colony by Colonel McCrae in his book, The 1860s in St. John's. But this was the examination room for St. Bonaventure's College, and you can see them in here doing their exams. It's an all-boys school. What was St. Bon's, which is now called the Archbishop Skinner Building, that was the first one. The school that's there now is the new St. Bon's after, I think it was 1906 they began the expansion. It is still a school and still in existence all those years later. This is a monstrance, and for people who don't know what a monstrance is, if I can use the French word montre, which means to show. In the Roman Catholic Church, and in fact, not just in the Roman Catholic faith, but in the Anglican faith and in the United Church, in the Christian denominations, you will have the concept of communion. And the Anglicans and the Catholics, even Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, in their church services, they reenact the Last Supper of Christ. So they repeat the words of Christ at the Last Supper: take, eat, drink. This is my body, this is my blood. Roman Catholics believe in something called transubstantiation, which means that when the priest says those words at Mass, that physically becomes the body, the presence of Christ among us, which is then distributed in communion, both in bread and in wine. That's what the chalices are for. That's why they're made of silver or gold, because it's the respect shown to Christ, the physical presence of Christ. And this is a monstrance. So you would put the communion wafer in here, the host in here, and the priest would then make the sign of the cross over the people in something called benediction. And people as well will pray before the Holy Eucharist. They'll pray to God, not only benediction, but it's called the exposition of the Holy Eucharist. So the priest will put this on the altar, and people will pray in an act of devotion. From Samuel Labasse, who was a silversmith in Dublin. This one would be from Bishop Power's time in about 1890 or so. Bishop Mullock's 1853 ciborium, again the ciborium being the cup for communion, for the distribution of the wafers. You can see Bishop Power's chalice there, and paten. Paten is a plate, and so that's what the individual communion wafer would be placed on for the priest. This was a gift to Archbishop Roche from the priests of the Archdiocese, and we're talking 1947 here, in a day when there were many, many, many more priests in the diocese than you would find now. And this is also a monstrance. It's by Gunnings of Dublin, and it's a particularly Irish, Gaelic, and Celtic one with the knotwork, and with the decoration and the symbols of. You'll see the crossed arms of the Franciscans in the cartouche up there, a reminder that the first 5 bishops were Franciscan, but also a reminder that St. Francis is one of the patrons of the Basilica Cathedral, as would be the star representing the Immaculate Conception, the cross with the stole, which is a symbol of John the Baptist, who's the titular patron of the cathedral. And then, what do you think the shamrock represents? Try St. Patrick.
Okay, St. Patrick, okay.
So you can see various scenes from the life of Christ around the base of the monstrance with the Celtic knotwork there. Ad majorem, to the greater gloriam, to the greater glory of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, in the host. And Anno Domini 1947, and if you were to read around it, Presbyteri donarunt, in Latin it reads, the priests gave this, hoc ostensorium, this monstrance. And what you can't see on the bottom is the name of Archbishop Rogan. It's a very interesting example of mid-20th century Celtic revival, or classical Celtic, interpreted by the firm of Gunnings of Dublin. A symbol of the Holy Spirit, and the rays of grace, light, whatever you want to call it, coming from the Holy Spirit. Finally, we have a donation of Patrick Helly in 1955. This is the Basilica Cathedral chalice, and its paten, its plate. And it's modeled in the shape of the Basilica Cathedral. And again, the crossed arms of the Franciscans, the Virgin Mary on the stem, and the coat of arms on the other side of Archbishop Skinner, who was the Archbishop at the time. This is from Gunnings in Dublin as well. And on the paten, you'll see St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland. This chalice here was a gift to Bishop Mulloch in 1851 from the Vatican, from the Pope. So these are very historic vessels. The Basilica chalice and paten was used by Pope John Paul when he had the Mass at Kitty Vitty in 1984. So these are reserved for the use of the Archbishop of St. John's and the Pope. We have an exhibit on Thomas Nangle here, and those are the plaques that tell the story of the priest who built he helped to create the Trail of Caribou monuments through Europe. He was the Newfoundland representative on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and at the request of the Newfoundland government, he exhumed the bodies of the Newfoundlanders who were lost in World War I and put them in proper graves, photographed them, and wrote their parents and families. That exacted a huge toll on him.
Sure.
He suffered very greatly from PTSD. Ultimately, he in fact left the Catholic Church and went to Rhodesia, where he started a family and became involved in politics. When he was a Catholic priest, though, he ministered to the troops in Beaumont Hamel. And that's his ciborium. So that's the communion vessel that was used to minister to the troops, the Newfoundland troops in World War I. It's got a lot of Celtic knotwork and design, and that was a gift to him from the mothers of the Catholic soldiers in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And it's inscribed to the Reverend Thomas Nangle from the mothers of the Catholic soldiers of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, 1918.
It's not a pocket watch, is it?
It's not a pocket watch. It's called a Pyx. A P-Y-X, a Pyx. And Nangle's friend Stephen Norris from Notre Dame Bay, classmates at St. Bon's, gave him, and Norris died at Guidocourt, but he gave him this Pyx. And that's a small sacred vessel used for holding the individual communion hosts. So Nangle would give communion to a soldier if he was dying or in an emergency. So those were very personal gifts, but they were also very sacred to the people for whom they meant a great deal. And it gave them great comfort to receive communion as they were dying. Here you can see a variety of things. One of the interesting ones is the mitre. Bishops wear these pointy hats, and that was one from 1955 from the Basilica's centenary, and it came from the Vatican. This one, again, was worn by Cardinal McGuigan from Toronto when he came and visited. And I think, again, it was a gift at the time of the centenary. Those are altar cards. Again, people may be aware that in the Roman Catholic Church, church services were spoken and said not in the vernacular, that it would be English for us, but they were in Latin. So the priest would, during the Mass, would read the Mass from these cards on the altar. These were donated in 1955, and they commemorate the centenary, 1855 to 1955. They were donated by John Hoskins, who was the cathedral architect. You can see at the top the basilica is there. And these were from Gunnings in Dublin as well. This is one of the most important collections of Irish decorative and church plate outside of Ireland. All these vestments would have names. So you'd have a stole, you'd have the cope, you'd have a capa magna or a great cape, you'd have a chasuble, you might even have a dalmatic if you were a deacon, and then they would have soutanes, and they would have surplices, and they would have all kinds of other names for different vestments. Again, this tradition of wearing special vestments comes right out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and just like the use of incense at Mass, or in fact the words of Christ of the Last Supper, there'd be traditional and scriptural bases. That is the Museum of the Basilica Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. You're all very welcome to come and visit. I suspect since we're all volunteers, you might want to make an appointment, but
Sure.
you're more than welcome to come and visit.
Well, personally, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time to explain this to me. You have a wonderful collection here, and
You're very welcome. It's a National Historic Site, and it's something that all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians should come see and be aware of. And it's also an incredible Canadian treasure.
and today it's doors open day, like we said. So
Doors
you know,
open. So those of us who've been involved with the Newfoundland Historic Trust are delighted to be here and volunteer to let people see these sites. And it's a great part of our heritage in this province.